Hello everyone, my name is Pixlriffs and welcome back to the Minecraft Survival Guide. I hope you're all having a good day. Today we are going to take these Allays home, and I've already actually taken one group of Allays from the other Woodland Mansion home, but this is the group that we found at the mansion that was burning down initially, and I decided on two different approaches to take the Allays back to our base. We are about 13,000, give or take 14,000 or so blocks out on the x-axis alone, not to mention the z-axis, and the other Woodland Mansion was about the same, but that group I actually took back via the overworld. I took a boat, I sailed across the ocean, I tried to find a path through land, and for the most part, the Allays followed me pretty faithfully, and we were able to get all 8 of the ones from the other Woodland Mansion home. With this group, we need to do something a little bit different, and I'm going to try and make a bit of space in my inventory for all of these leads and a dark oak plank block just to make sure that I can throw one of those on the ground every so often to make sure the Allays are still following me. We are going to take them back through the nether this time so that we can get them back to our base, and we're not going to worry too much about what happens if one of the Allays gets left behind because we have plenty more of them back at our base. But as I mentioned in the previous episode, I do like feeling like we've rescued these Allays fully and we've brought them back to our base from where they were held in captivity at the Woodland Mansion. So with all 6 of them flying around me like a bunch of balloons, I'm just going to try and drag them through this nether portal, and we should find that the leads pop off as they go through the portal. We can walk around the other side, simply back up, and that should be all 6 of them gone on through. So let me step on through to the nether, and hopefully none of them have gotten into any trouble already. There we go, we got some leads on the ground, and here in the nether, you'll find that there are some slightly hazardous environment for them, but we don't need to worry too much about that, since if I walk a little way down this corridor that I have dug out over here, hopefully all of them should end up following me. Now we've got 4 of them. I'm going to throw a plank on the ground every so often to make sure that they come on down here. That's once again 5 of them. Let's see if we can track the 6th one down, because I did notice one that was just kind of flying around here, and it might have ended up going back through to the overworld. Hey, not to worry, we're going to keep going. So the plan is that we're just going to run down this corridor that I have created, this nether tunnel. This is going to lead all the way back to our base, past this bastion, which I noticed on the way, so I kind of put a little viewing window in there in our corridor just to make sure that we wouldn't end up missing out on that in future. And for the most part, the Allays are going to follow me. Unlike bees or any other kind of flying mob like that, they don't need to touch down on a block. So even in the areas where they can fly off the edge of these platforms, they should be pretty good at getting themselves back onto it. That 6th Allay that we've left behind at the portal should be okay. We don't need to worry too much about it. We can always head back and see if it's slipped through the portal to the overworld or if it's simply floating around in that crimson forest. And so if I had the time and the resources, I would have made this a covered tunnel all the way through. I would have just made sure that these side areas were filled in, for example, just to make sure that the Allays definitely couldn't escape out the sides or get stuck in the ceiling or anything like that. But for the most part, I find that Allays are pretty robust in terms of their following mechanics, and we've got all 5 of them with us. Okay, perfect. The main thing you have to make sure of is that you don't fly around, because once again, as I mentioned in the previous episode, if you end up flying, you accelerate too fast for the Allays to really follow you. There's a little bit of time before they start to try and catch up to the player, and once you are outside of a certain follow radius, they will simply lose interest in following you. So we can sprint down this corridor, but that's basically all we can do, and we don't need to worry about any mobs around the outside attacking the Allays, but there are occasionally environmental hazards that we might need to get rid of, like fire, for example, or lava. The fact that this goes through a nether fortress and a basalt delta is some pretty intense stuff for the player, but the Allays are dealing with that pretty well, and I think once we get out into this little stripe of corridor here, there we go, we can check behind us and we still have all 5 of the Allays following. So hopefully this should be how this trip progresses. We shouldn't have to worry about them getting off course or flying into lava or anything, and hopefully we can make our way back to my base area with all 5 of the Allays. This final bridge here is the last area we should need to cross, and from here we might be able to just glide down towards that cobblestone structure that contains the portal. Let's glide on over here first of all, just to make sure the coast is clear. All 5 of those Allays still following me, which is perfect. They should have an easy time navigating around the lava over here, and we should just be able to glide on down to where we've got the frogs leashed up, and all 5 of those allays should be following. There we go. We don't even need to take a roll call. We got it. Okay, let's throw a block in front of the portal there, and any of the allays that dive to follow it should just end up going into the portal. We've got one more there. If we throw a block in front of the portal like that, it should fly over with enough momentum that'll just carry it straight into the portal. And it seems like at some point I may have accidentally taken an item from an allay, which means it's going to be flying loose around here. It might even have gone back through to the nether. So 3 of them have definitely made it through this portal. A couple of them may have gone back, depending on how quickly they emerged from the portal. But for the moment, at least, we can bring them over to where the other 8 allays are waiting for them. And if you hadn't guessed already, this episode is going to be all about allays and the different stuff we can do with them. So I'm going to make another fence post here. We're going to pop that down, tie up these 3 allays to that. I'll grab a few more leads, we'll head on back to get the ones that we're missing, and then we'll talk about what the allays can do for us. And so after a successful rescue trip, we have all 6 of the allays from that Woodland Mansion attached to this fence post, and all 8 of the allays from the other Woodland Mansion over here. So we've now got 14 allays just hovering around looking for stuff to do. And so at this point, I think it's going to be a good idea to grab 1 or 2 of them and recap what we know about allays and what we can now use them for. And so for a nice easy early example, we're going to bring these 2 allays down to the farm. We're going to detach the leads from them, and we're going to take the items from their hands. And we're going to replace those items with something that we've got here on the farm. Let's say that this one can be harvesting carrots, and we'll say that this one can harvest some potatoes for us. Now we're going to go along these rows with our fortune pickaxe, and we are going to take out all of the carrots and potatoes that are growing in this row. And you'll see that the allays dutifully follow behind, pick those up, and throw them to the player. So this allay's harvesting any carrots that it finds on the ground, and this one's harvesting all of the potatoes, and it's just going to throw all of them to you once it's gathered them. Now, the allay can only hold about a stack of items similar to what it's got, and it won't necessarily collect absolutely everything, but if the items are on the ground within a certain radius of the player, it should be able to locate those items, pick them up, and will throw them at the player that's given them the item. So without having to go and collect them myself, I just got over a stack of carrots and potatoes. All I had to do was break the blocks, and the allays did the rest. They will not replant the crops for you though, so we are going to have to make sure that we replant these rows. But the whole purpose of an allay is to collect items and deliver them to the player. There is another way you can have them deliver the item to somewhere else though, and for that we're going to head over to the storage system and grab some redstone components. Because as their musical noises might have you believe, the allays love music. They like to sing and they like to dance, and so anything that produces music is going to naturally be something of an attraction for them. In this case, I don't have any note blocks already prepared, but I'm going to grab a block of redstone here. We're going to break that down. We're going to craft some note blocks using wood planks and redstone dust. We're going to pop down this note block, and we're going to play it a couple of times, and as we play it, you will see very faint sound particles traveling to the allays. That attaches them to this note block, and now, when we end up harvesting some of those items, the allays will still go and collect them, but instead of dropping them off at the player, they drop them off over at the note block. They kind of throw it in weird directions sometimes, but then obviously when they notice the items on the ground, they will simply pick them up and continue to throw them. And they will remember the location of this note block for about 30 seconds, so you can go ahead and harvest a whole bunch of crops in that time, and the allays will return them to the note block instead of grabbing them and throwing them to the player. If the note block hasn't played again within that time, however, the allays will simply go back to giving their items to the player. But right now, we've collected everything the allays have harvested, and we're going to replant it all here in the field. Now, in order to prevent the allays from returning items to the player at all, we need to craft something that's going to keep this note block ringing on a regular interval. And for that, we're going to resort to a very old-fashioned but still pretty reliable redstone timer. Or you might more accurately term this a redstone clock, since it outputs a redstone signal on a reliable interval. We're going to place 4 redstone repeaters facing around in a square like this, with redstone dust on the corners, completing the square. We're going to right-click on each of these repeaters until they are at their maximum range, their maximum delay, and then by attaching a lever to one of these redstone dust and flicking it on and off quickly once, a redstone signal will travel around this set of repeaters continuously in a circle. If we place a note block in the ground next to this piece of redstone dust, every time the redstone dust powers the block underneath it, it will ring the note block, sending a signal to those allays and reminding them that they need to drop off their items here at the note block. The carrots and the potatoes are still growing, so we don't have any current examples of the crops, but if I throw some carrots over here, and if I throw some potatoes over there and over there, you'll find that the allays collect all of those and then they go over there to drop them off on top of the note block. This kind of redstone clock will basically run forever, by the way, and there are two ways of disabling it, either by flicking on the lever so that it powers all the way around, at which point it will get stuck, or by breaking a piece of redstone dust where the redstone current will not be able to travel around the circuit again, and you can simply put the redstone dust back down. So for those purposes, it's not the most sophisticated timer. We want something ideally that we can switch on or off, but there are plenty of ways of doing that, which we'll get into a little later. But as you can see, that's a pretty effective way of getting allays to throw items at a specific block and never return them to the player, which means we can use allays in collection mechanisms, either where the player isn't involved, so the allays are doing the collecting with the player not needing to have any kind of input, or when the player traveling to a hopper is going to interrupt the flow of using the farm. I'm going to show you my favorite example of what I want allays to do for us, namely farming mangrove wood. At this point, you've probably done a reasonable amount of farming mangrove wood, especially if you've been following along with some of the builds that we've done in this series, and you probably consider it a massive pain in the neck. And you'd probably be right about that, because mangrove wood has a lot of stuff getting in the way of you just harvesting the wood in the first place. There are these mangrove roots, there are the vines that dangle down, the fact that the logs are suspended off the ground, and a lot of mangrove leaves generate proportionally to how many logs we get out of one of these. I'm going to grab my silk touch hoe out of my shulker box here, and we're going to harvest all of the leaves and the roots and the moss carpets and everything from this tree. We're going to take away all of that, and we'll see exactly how many logs are inside the tree itself. There we go, that is all of the wood inside one of these mangrove trees. And obviously it starts about 5 or 6 blocks off the ground, so that can be a little bit rough to begin with, but we've got all of these leaves. So much additional material has to be mined before we can get hold of what is probably less than half a stack of mangrove logs. Yeah, a few of the leaves probably despawned as I cleared them out, but that's still basically 8 stacks of leaves, a decent amount of moss carpet, and close to a stack of mangrove roots. What are we gonna do with it all? Well, typically what I do is I end up composting it, because there's nothing else you can really do with mangrove leaves. The propagules that you use to regrow mangrove trees grow from below the leaves. They don't drop from the leaves themselves. So aside from decorations, the best thing you can do with mangrove leaves really is compost them, hoping to get some return on the investment of bone meal that you spent growing the propagule in the first place. And it might surprise some of you to learn that mangrove roots can also be composted. So basically every part of this tree that is not a log can be put through a composter for additional bone meal, and hopefully you get a return on your investment. But my favorite way of harvesting mangrove wood is to let the allays clear out all of those additional blocks, to break them all with silk touch so that all of the leaves drop on the ground, and to have the allays automatically deliver those items to a composter so that they can be composted and we don't have to be interrupted in our task of breaking down the mangrove logs. By the way, yeah, 22 logs from that one. So we'd have to have 3 trees of equivalent size in order to get to a full stack of material. In the meantime, though, we've ended up with more bone meal than we started with, so that's definitely a good thing. And in order to have the allays drop stuff off over here, we are going to have to make some changes to how our automatic composting setup works. For a start, it's going to be best if we place it in the ground somewhere, because as you saw over there at the farm, the allays are much better, more accurate if they are throwing items on top of a block that's in the ground, because otherwise, if they're throwing items at a note block, they're going to be throwing them from all different angles. They're going to be throwing stuff on the top, they're going to be throwing stuff at the sides, they're going to be throwing stuff on the other side if there are multiple allays. It is a lot easier to guarantee the allays' accuracy if they are throwing something at a note block that is at ground level. So we're going to put a note block right here. Of course, our automatic composting setup is going to have to go below that, and so we'll need some way of accessing that in a second. But first of all, we need to make sure that the composter is is buried in the ground and is going to output into a double chest. We'll place 2 hoppers facing into that chest. We'll put the 2 composters over the top. We'll have 2 hoppers facing down into the composters that are going to receive and compost all the organic material we can grab. And now we need some sort of guarantee that the items delivered to this note block are going to end up in these hoppers, which isn't going to happen if you just put the note block over the top of here, since the note block is a full block and the hopper can't pull items directly through. But we know something that can pull items directly through a note block, and that is a hopper minecart. So we're going to grab some iron and make another hopper minecart or 2. In fact, for now, we're just going to make 1 hopper minecart, because I feel like conducting a bit of an experiment with this. We're going to place our hopper minecart on some rails facing in this direction, and over here, we're going to place some iron bars, which will prevent the hopper minecart from rolling any further than that. But it will roll halfway off of a block if we give it a quick nudge. We'll remove the rail, we'll remove the iron bar, and we'll collect each of those from the hoppers since they can't be composted, so they're not going anywhere. Now we're going to place 2 note blocks directly above the area where we've just got the hopper minecart and the hoppers, and we're going to push the note blocks down over the hopper minecart. This is kind of similar to what we've done in the wool farm, where we collect wool from the sheep as it is sheared by keeping hopper minecarts embedded in a block of grass below them. Unfortunately, a piston will allow us to move a note block, so we can simply place the 2 pistons on there, activate them both at the same time using a button, and these note blocks are now directly over the top of a hopper minecart. So now any items we throw into the center of these note blocks ends up getting composted. We heard the sound of the composter like that, and we'll quickly reveal this setup just so we can see what's going on and collect anything else that's fallen in there in the meantime. Now, if we've grabbed the materials from our redstone clock, all we need to do is set up the same redstone clock next to these note blocks, making sure that we don't end up powering a block adjacent to the hoppers. We're going to be powering this block here. That's going to ring one of the note blocks, but we're not going to end up locking any of the hoppers with any of these redstone pulses. We'll make sure to set the repeaters to 4 ticks of delay, and we activate that with a single flick of the lever, and the note block will ring, reminding the Allays to come and drop off their items over here. Now I'm going to drop off all of the blocks from my inventory, since we don't really need too much of this stuff with us, and you'll notice that the Allays are no longer following me anymore, because that note block ringing is a signal to them to hang around the note block instead of following the player constantly to drop off items with me, which is perfect. And if the ringing of the note block gets a little distracting for you, you can always go into the music settings and turn down the jukebox and note block slider. If we put that at a 1%, you'll barely hear it in the background, but the particle that pops up from the note block will notify you that it is still ringing. At this point, we're going to grab some mangrove propagules, grow them, and then we can get some of the blocks that we're going to be giving to the Allays themselves. We got a slightly smaller example of a tree this time around, but I think giving them the mangrove roots and the mangrove leaves is really the 2 elements of this that are most likely to be acquired in bulk and need to be composted. So with an empty hand, we can take the carrot away from this Allay and give it some mangrove roots. And now any mangrove roots that fall on the floor around here, it should fly over and collect them, and it will return them to that note block where eventually, after a couple of tries, it should be able to get them into the hopper minecart. But I think it's going to be a good idea to have 2 hopper minecarts underneath this after all, because there are still some items which aren't making it into the hopper minecart, even though it's embedded in the center of these 2 note blocks. For now, though, we're going to take the potato off of this guy, and we're going to give him the mangrove leaves, and once again, we should be able to harvest this entire tree. Any mangrove leaves that end up dropped on the ground, that guy's going to now collect, and they should leave the propagules alone, but throw the mangrove leaves into the composting setup, and any that end up on the ground nearby, they'll simply collect them and try throwing them again until they get their aim right. Yeah, there were a total of 5 logs in this tree, which is pretty funny. That's probably the smallest mangrove tree I've ever seen. And some of those mangrove logs I'm going to turn into a pair of trapdoors that I can use to open this up and collect any items that end up in the chest down here. But now I can farm a bunch of mangrove wood, and we're going to place the propagules diagonally so that the mangrove roots don't grow and completely destroy the propagules on either side. And what we're left with is a huge mass of mangrove foliage that we want to extract the logs from, so we can let our Allays come and pick up any material that's dropped on the ground, and we can focus on collecting the logs. Of course, if you have any free inventory slots, the player is still going to be picking up items that drop from this process, so you're still going to find your inventory clogged with mangrove leaves and mangrove roots. But one of the things I recommend doing is getting rid of any of those from your inventory, and then spreading spreading out any mangrove logs you've got in your inventory so that they fill up any available spaces. Once we've filled up our inventory with mangrove logs like that, we won't be able to pick up any of the leaves or roots, and the allays will be left to pick those up as they find them. Which means that if I leave a load of mangrove leaves on the ground like this, the allay that's in charge of collecting mangrove leaves is going to fly over and get them, leaving me to simply collect all of the logs here without the hassle of returning to the ground every so often to drop all these leaves into a composter. In fact, in my experience, you end up generating so many mangrove leaves from this process that it's usually a good idea to have multiple allays all collecting the same item. There's no reason you should only have one allay doing that, so it's often a good idea to get a couple of allays flying around here collecting mangrove leaves. That way you can be sure that something is done about them before they end up despawning. We'll disable this redstone clock for now, but I think it has served its purpose. We've also been able to gather over 1.5 stacks of mangrove logs during that process, which I think is a pretty decent haul from just a few propagules. And in the chest down here, which is actually too low for me to click from the surface, so I should probably look into changing that, we have just over 1/2 stack of bone meal, which is actually a decent amount considering that we spent less than that to grow the mangrove trees. We're actually earning bone meal. So that's a great example of how these allays can be really helpful. And I'm going to keep these two as my dedicated mangrove farmers. We're going to leave them on the fence post here just so they're not following me around constantly as we move around here, because very close by we actually have another great example of how allays can help us with collecting some stuff. And why is this chicken just stuck behind this fence post? Excuse me? Ma'am, do you need to leave? I think this chicken has just been stuck there for a little while, and okay, just wants to get in there with the sniffers. That's fine. So the sniffers here are another great example of something that the allays can help us with, because they will drop seeds on the ground as they sniff them up from these grass blocks, and other dirt variants can be used for this as well, but unfortunately, in order to collect the seeds automatically, we would need to spread out some hopper minecarts over a pretty large area. A sniffer needs a minimum of 25 grass blocks to be sniffing out and digging up new seeds, so that's a minimum of 25 blocks that we would need to cover with some sort of hopper minecart and rail collection mechanism underneath here. But in the meantime, my allays over here are straining at the leash to help, and we can unleash a couple more from the fence post here, and then simply give them the pitcher pods and the torch flower seeds that the sniffers have been digging up. From that point on, any torch flower seeds or pitcher pods that end up in the sniffer pen will be collected by the allays and dropped off at the player or a nearby note block. So in this way, the allay and the sniffers are actually really compatible, because instead of automating the process with noisy hopper minecarts, we can just leave allays around, which are, I guess, noisy in a different way, but that's kind of not the point. And considering we've had these sniffers here for quite a while now, we could have had way more pitcher pods and torch flower seeds if we'd had a better collection mechanism, but I really didn't want to invest in hopper minecarts running all the way underneath this. But in the near future, we're going to set up a more permanent position for these sniffers, so they're not simply in a corral out the front of my storage room, and at that point we'll be able to use the allays to their fullest potential and set up a permanent note block setup with the allays helping us. Now, for one last practical example, before we move on to some other stuff about the allay, let's return to our Amethyst geode farm. Unfortunately, the entrance to my Amethyst geode farm is a little impractical for the allay, since it has some water right here on the surface, and allays cannot go through water. They will sort of dip down into water and then leave hovering above the surface. So we're actually going to remove that, but thankfully, it's just a water source placed on the top here, and from here the water should completely disappear, leaving us with just the ladder. Now I'm going to use my elytra to fly down gently, and once we hit the ladder, hopefully the allay will be able to follow me. And if I swim back over here, yes, there we go, the allay has followed me, perfect. Now this is another example of where I wanted the allays to help us out, because the amethyst shards that we can gather from this geode will float to the surface, and we don't have any kind of collection hoppers in here right now, because getting water streams to flow into those hoppers would be a little bit tricky with the size and shape of this room. Fortunately, the allay will simply wait on the surface until these amethyst shards float back up, and then they'll deliver them to the player. So we can simply float around this room, breaking the fully grown amethyst clusters, not worrying about whether or not we collect the crystals, and then once we return to the surface, the allay is simply going to throw all of the amethyst shards it's collected to me. Or alternatively, we can set up another note block and hopper contraption, which the allay is going to drop off all of the amethyst shards at once it's picked them up from the surface. Although it looks like I am going to have to make sure that the allay can't fly out of the ladder once it's down here, because it has a tendency to just disappear area up to the surface again. It'll always come back down here as long as we're down here, but it's definitely going to be worth having something to prevent it from leaving the area if we want these to be dedicated amethyst geode farmers. And trust me, you are going to want to be farming amethyst shards by the time you end up working with allays, or at least you will want to have a decent amount of them around you. Because if you didn't find too many allays and you're interested in using them more, amethyst shards are the key to getting more of them. To demonstrate this, we're going to need a diamond. I've got a few spare in the item filter system over here. I'm going to grab a few spare planks, and we're going to craft ourselves a jukebox. At this point in the series, we have acquired several of these music discs, but we haven't really discussed what the use of them is. And the main use of them really is to listen to music in-game. There are several collectible music discs that you can find in dungeons and different loot chests. There are a handful of them which you can acquire by getting a skeleton to kill a creeper with an arrow, so there's some really fun mechanics that we can get into there a little bit later. But the ones we've acquired so far have been from dungeon loot, and in this case from the Trail Ruins, where we picked up the Relic music disc. Now, if we play a jukebox near an allay, you'll notice that they start to do this little side-to-side head bob and twirl. As I mentioned earlier, allays love music, so they like to dance when a jukebox is playing nearby. But if you have some amethyst shards and you give one to an allay while it is dancing, you'll notice that heart particles appear in much the same way as when you breed two animals together, and the allays simply duplicate. They split in half. We can switch off the jukebox for now, since I didn't want anybody to believe that the episode was ending. That's the music I was using for the outro. But as you can see, yes, we have a second allay that has split off from the first. And it won't be holding the same items or anything, otherwise you could duplicate items pretty easily, and that might be kind of cheaty. And if you give an allay an amethyst shard when it is not dancing, it will simply look around for more amethyst shards to collect. But if you give an allay an amethyst shard while it is dancing like that, it will duplicate. It's a kind of unique breeding mechanic in that it's more like mitosis than breeding. They simply clone themselves, and it's kind of a neat mechanic that sets allays apart as a sort of mystical mob compared to some of the more basic animals. Additionally, once an allay has split like that, similar to other mobs, they have a cooldown before they can be split again. So you can't simply spam click an allay and breed a whole army of them. It's a little bit different to that. So why might you want to do this in the first place? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, Woodland Mansions aren't the only places you can find allays. You can find them in pillager outposts, in the cages outside. And in our case, we didn't find any at the first couple of pillager outposts I raided, so we had to go to the Woodland Mansions in order to get hold of them. But if you're lucky enough to find some allays near a pillager outpost, you're only ever going to find 2 of them per cage, so there's a chance you could only end up with 2 allays, and as we've seen, 2 allays isn't always enough to do a job properly. You might also be on a multiplayer server, so a limited supply of allays would not be a great idea if every player wants to use them for something, and even the amount that you find in a Woodland Mansion might not be enough for some players. In addition to that, they are flying mobs. They do have a tendency to go wandering off, and while their player following mechanics are usually fairly robust, that only happens when they're holding an item that was given to them by the player. If they're not holding an item, there's a chance that they could just float away, and you'll probably find them in that spot a little bit later. Similar to bees, except with less of a tendency to fly into water and drown. But finally, as we have already seen, getting a whole bunch of them back from a far-flung location like a Woodland Mansion can be a little bit of a pain, and so it's often a good idea to simply bring 1 allay with you, and then set up a jukebox, grab a couple of amethyst shards, and duplicate it a couple more times to increase your number of allays, instead of spending all of the time and effort bringing home every single one. Of course, in my case, I felt sympathetic to them, and it sort of felt like a weird thing leaving them all there after we had rescued them, so I figured I would bring them back here and give them some fun stuff to do. And yes, we all recognize the irony inherent to rescuing these things from Woodland Mansions and then keeping them attached to fence posts, but honestly, much like bees, it is one of the only ways of making sure that they don't just wander off eventually. And of course, as you're exploring the world, a couple of allays following you might be kind of a fun thing, but you don't want this entire swarm of them following you everywhere you go. So I think in future we are going to set up like a little dwelling for these allays, maybe some sort of system where we can take out a couple of allays at a time. I have some ideas for that actually, but for the moment it is just a good thing to have them around. And I think we're going to use them for a variety of other applications in this world, because there are plenty of ways that allays can be convenient, and they're simply going to add life to any collection mechanisms where we want to use them. Another really useful function of allays is that they can also collect unstackable items. If I give this one the relic music disc, it will recognize another relic music disc and pass that over to me, which means that they can be used to sort through different items. And in cases like this, for example, where you might want your wooden hose and your music discs sorted out for you, the Allays should be able to help you with that. But for now, me and these Allays have got work to do, so that's where we're going to leave it for this episode. And folks, I hope you've enjoyed this introductory look at Allays. Trust me, we're going to be doing a lot more cool stuff with them in the near future. But for now, thank you so much for watching this episode. My name has been Pixlriffs. Don't forget to leave a like on this episode if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you folks soon. Take care. Bye for now.